I think my name's Dave Crossman. I'm Managing Director Australasia for IIC Technologies. And I think the first speaker of the afternoon session, Niall, talked about imposter syndrome, and there's no syndrome. I'm totally an imposter here. I'm a hydrographer, so I've got a deep hydrographic specialist knowledge, and I'm a managing director, so I don't do so much hands-on tool stuff, and I have no idea about QGIS, but I'm really passionate about the outcomes that have been able to be developed by our team on the UMap capability that I'm about to talk to. So in the time I've got, every person I've spoken to over the last few days, the first thing they've said is, who's IIC? So I'm going to take a couple of minutes just to explain who we are. And then I'm going to talk about UMap. And I'm going to give you the context, so the background, why it was developed, talk about a case study that was used to prove and trial the UMap that was developed, and then the outcomes for our client. And then I'm going to take a couple of minutes, if I haven't run out of time, just to talk about some other opportunities. So IIC Technologies, we've actually been operating in the region for over 15 years. We started back in 1993. We're a family-owned and operated business, small in comparison to many of our other contemporaries out there. We've only got about 1,200 employees. But we're ISO accredited. We've got 8 offices across 4 continents. You can see those in the bottom left-hand side of the image. So we've got an office in Australia and New Zealand, which I oversee. We do work for government and for commercial entities, but government's kind of been the backbone of our business, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years and in this region. We've got 6 divisions, so we call ourselves a full spectrum provider. So I would say to people, if it looks like or smells like geospatial, we probably do it, or we could do it. So at the front end, we do everything from data gathering and land, sea and air. We do processing and bulk processing. We do product generation, and for our clients, we've got an innovation centre which created UMap, and they do all sorts of developments for our various clients. The other divisions you can see there, the last one on the list is the IIC Academy, which I'll touch on at the very end if I've got time. So that's who we are. Like I said, we do a lot of work for government. We've probably got over 50 national authorities that we support around the world. And in our region, this is the client list that we've got. The ones in blue are the ones that we're actively working with right now or over the last couple of years. So we've got quite a good reach into the region, and that's part of the reason why I'm so passionate about trying to find resolves and support for the Southwest Pacific in particular. Right, so that's who IIC is. If you want to know more, please ask me later, and I'm happily talk about it. So moving on to the core of the presentation, UMap. So UMap is a system that has been developed under contract to the Canadian Hydrographic Service. It's a QGIS plugin, and what it does is it takes data gathered by anyone, and it'll take it in and provide you with a chart-like product. Now, I'll talk about this in a bit more detail shortly, but essentially the Canadian Hydrographic Service were really concerned that they weren't providing any kind of safety of navigation support to the Inuit populations in the Arctic region. And so this was an activity specifically aimed at providing them with a tool that they could use to support not just safety of navigation, but all of their activities in and around the maritime region. So the situation. Every nation that's a signatory to the International Maritime Organisation, and that is Australia and New Zealand and just about every nation in the world, are required under the obligations to IMO to provide adequate charting for the safe navigation of vessels within their waters. Now, every nation struggles to do it because it's a massive job, but Canada in particular has got some really big deficiencies. So Canada has got the largest coastline in the world, and it's got an exceptionally large area of navigable waters. So a couple of the statistics I've got there. So in the depth range of 0 to 200 metres, which is an important depth range obviously, only 23% is actually surveyed. And of that, 66% needs to be resurveyed because it was actually surveyed using traditional methodologies, not modern technologies. But of more significance to this presentation, 90% of the Arctic waters where the Inuit populations reside, in the depth range of 0 to 100 metres, where you're likely to have incidents, 90% is completely unsurveyed. Now, the reason for that, I mean, it's not CHS's fault. They haven't been sitting on their laurels, fat, dumb and happy. The reality is as I said, they've got this massive coastline, but they just don't have the resource or capacity to either go out and capture the data or to turn it into nautical charts and publications. And in fact, they contract IIC to do both those parts for them. But Canada, like every nation, they basically have to prioritise their activities. And most nations have a risk-based matrix that they will use to prioritise their survey efforts and their funding. Now, it almost always comes down to gross tonnage of shipping, access to and from major ports, areas of dangers or extreme risk to navigation like confined channels and fairways. And so when you take that into account, what you end up with is a situation where you can see on the right-hand side of that image vast expanses of white where there's no soundings, but where you can see the coloured lines, essentially that's where they've gone out and they've actually actively captured data. But what you can see is they're essentially direct lines between each of the major ports. So a ship can go out and they know, well, if we stay in this area here, it's been surveyed to modern standards and we're going to be safe. Now, if you look at the little wee magenta rectangle on the right-hand side, it's enlarged on the left, and you can see that you've got this massive area in that magenta box, and there's only one little bit of data gathered in the straight line, which is the shipping route. All of that inshore area has not a single sounding. Now, the reality is that the Inuit populations live and breathe in that nearshore area. So they do all of their hunting, so transit for hunting, all of their fishing. It's much safer to go the shortest distance between 2 points. It's far more sheltered. So all of their activities are in and around those inshore areas where there are more likely to be risks and dangers and where there's actually no charting whatsoever. So the CHS realised that they needed to do more. And so they established a program called the Community Hydrographic Program, and as it says right there, it's to support Indigenous and coastal communities in the collection and use of bathymetric data to improve the collective understanding of the ocean floor in poorly studied areas. So essentially what they wanted to do is they knew they didn't have the money to go in and survey those vast amounts of areas. So what they wanted to do was say, okay, well, let's empower the local Inuit people to go in and do the data capture themselves. That way, they will be working and capturing data in the areas that are of greatest interest to them, i.e. where they're going to be working the most, and they can have buy-in, they can be empowered to do it. So they identified that there are essentially three challenges. The first was data gathering. The second was the processing of the gathered data and what they call qualification. I'd call it quality control or the assignment of assessment of the quality of the data. And the third one is cartographic representation, so turning that gathered data into a chart-like product or a map. Now, each one of those three stages are hugely expensive. They take a vast amount of time, and they all require specialist equipment and specialist knowledge. So the reality is, they couldn't go to every community and train up 3 or 4 people per community and let them go. So what they did was they tried to develop a process which would best enable in an efficient way these communities. So they addressed data gathering and data processing first. So on the data gathering side, they did a whole suite of initiatives. And the first ones were to take high-end multi-beams and bathymetric sensors, the sorts of things that I would use during my day-to-day profession, and they tried to train up the local communities on how to use these really advanced systems. But the training burden and the reality was that just wasn't actually particularly effective. So they moved on to 2 other methodologies that were far better. The first was to provide them almost like a black box resolve, where they got given a piece of equipment, and there's a photo later which I'll point out, a piece of equipment, it's all inclusive, they strap it on the side of their vessel, they turn it on, they go out and do their bits, they either intentionally gather or they just transit with it on. When they get back, they can download the data and the system's looked after itself. So no real training required, just fitting and set to work. And then the next thing they did was they realised that most of the commercial off-the-shelf fish finders that were being used were actually pretty good. And they're all integrated with GPS. So what they did was they got simple data loggers and they gave them out to the communities and said, look, plug these in, turn them on whenever you're out and about, and log the data when you come back, download it. And so that's what they did. So those last two things in particular were quite useful because it didn't require that heavy training burden or multi-million-dollar systems. Step two, again, they recognised that they couldn't train the local communities on how to process or expect them to splash out to buy all of the software required. So what they resolved in them was to build a team within the Canadian Hydrographic Service called the Community Hydrography team. So what happens now is any of these Inuit communities can gather data and they upload it to the Community Hydrographic team, and they'll do all the processing and data cleaning and quality management for them, and then send it back. So we've now resolved issue 1 and 2, but the problem was this last bit, the cartographic representation, taking all of that information and actually giving it back to them in a format that is useful. And that was such a big problem that the communities started falling off. They lost interest because it was taking too long. So the CHS had a great idea, and they said, well, let's do a speed mapping challenge at the Canadian Hydro Conference in 2022. So our team went along and they presented what became UMap, which is the QGIS plugin, and they won the competition, so CHS commissioned them to develop it further. And that's what I want to talk about now. So it was built by IIC last year. It was developed and released tail end of last year or early this year. And essentially QGIS requires 5 inputs only. So chart limitations, you guys will know how to do this better than I will, and we've got a little demonstration soon. So the chart limits, the shoreline, topographic contours, optional if you've got them, bathymetric data, and then you select the parameters that you want for the smoothing and the sounding selection. And that's simply by saying what scale you want the community map to be depicted at. Once you've done those, the output is what CHS required us to call a community map. So CHS are in an interesting situation because they're a national hydrographic authority, and what they're wanting to do is provide safety of navigation support to the Inuit community, but they couldn't get in a situation where they were seen to be putting out a product that wasn't actually meeting international standards. So, oh dear. I will talk loudly while I plug myself up. So what they did was, said rather than calling it a chart, we call it a community map. And in the community map, it'll have all the information that's required for them, but we won't be at risk of reliability because it's not a chart. It's not a national authoritative stamped chart. It's actually just a map. You know? Fun and games. Okay, so in order for a community map to be produced, what we've got is vertical reference or vertical adjustment. So when you put your digital terrain model into this, you can put multiple in. And what you have to do is say, okay, well, this one is the primary reference. And so what the system does first is it takes all the different DTMs and it will adjust them vertically to align with whichever you have said is the reference DTM. It then does a deconfliction. So what it does is it takes all of the sounding data that you might have, all the bathymetric data across those different levels, and it will deconflict so they don't overlap, and it'll always do a shoal-biased selection. Then what it does is true cartographic process. So IIC are nautical cartography experts, so we've actually built this to full specifications. So even though it can't be called an official chart because the underlying bathymetry isn't captured to international standards, but what we're visualising is actually exactly what you'd expect to see on a chart, except for the colours. So when it does the sounding selection, it does a shoal bias, it interpolates, it fills in gaps, it does contouring, it does interpolated contouring, and it does a sounding selection such that it gives the best representation of the seafloor topology for the user. And of course, as you zoom in, different soundings will appear to give you greater and greater levels of detail and understanding. So that's what, to us, a community map is. So once we had produced it, they decided that it needed to be tested, so they did a pilot study. And so they undertook an 18-day project, and that included the setup, set to work, transit, data gathering, etc., etc. So they actually started by getting satellite derived bathymetry, and you can see that on the left-hand side, all that nice orange stuff, that's the satellite derived bathymetry, and they use that to educate the line planning, and the line planning are those lines of colours, and that's actually where the vessels ran and gathered the data. The team gathered the data, they submitted it to the Community Hydrographic team, and overnight they were able to process and clean the data, and they sent it back to the Inuit community, or the pilot study team. The pilot study team then took the bathymetry, so that was satellite-derived bathymetry and over 300 kilometres of survey data, ingested into UMap, and in about 60 seconds they had their community map, their chart-like product. And the reason that's so significant is normally that tail-end process, the visualisation, would at least take days, normally weeks or months. And I'm going to show you a little YouTube video in a second, which is actually the real-time processing out. It takes about 45 seconds. So the outcome product, we'll have a look at it a little bit more closely shortly, but on the right-hand side there, you can see that you've got, in green, the land, then you've got soundings, you've got colour-banded contouring. So what I'm going to do now is start this little video, and I'm going to use my complete lack of experience to explain what's going on. So they're in QGIS, they're going to open up UMap, and if we pause it there, you can see that there's a series of things that need to be selected. So first of all, they're going to choose their map extents, and they'll do that just by dragging and dropping shortly. I mentioned that they choose the sounding scale, or the scale of the chart, and that determines the sounding selection and the contouring. On the left-hand side here, you can see that they've got the shoreline information on the top, they've got the satellite-derived bathymetry, and then they've got the collected bathymetry down here as well. So they'll first of all just select their area, that's it there. The scale is 1 to 22,000. They're selecting they just selected the coastline. Now they're going to select the satellite-derived bathymetry and the survey data, and then they hit run, and this would normally take weeks. It'd be funny if my laptop crashed now and it actually took ages. And that's it, it's done. And so they'll just take off the image background. So if you zoom in onto this file now, as you zoom in, you'll get increased levels of information, soundings, contours and stuff like that, but it's literally that quick. And so it's not an official chart, but for the Inuit community, they can take that information, they can ingest it into their navigation systems, or they can ingest it into their own GIS systems, and they can use it. So there's a couple of really good outcomes that came from this. Oh, so here's some images zoomed in a little bit more. So you can see that all of the soundings have been deconflicted. There's no overwriting. The colour banding does not look like a nautical chart, but as I said, it actually conforms to full nautical chart structures. And it's a useful product. So the outcomes, we were commissioned by CHS to build it, and it has been proved to be successful, and it is supporting the Inuit communities. Because of the speed and the ease of the turnaround now, the communities have re-engaged, and they're actually out there gathering the data, and it's working really nicely. As I mentioned a few times, it's not an official chart because the underlying bathymetry isn't to international hydrographic standards, but what you're actually getting as an outcome for visualisation does conform to all the normal standards. The really cool thing was that CHS said build it so it can be used anywhere in the world. And they allowed us to obviously release this free onto QGIS. So it's out there, you can use it anywhere in the world. So for me, I'm really passionate about the Pacific, so I'm really hoping that we can get it in use up in the Pacific Islands. But guys like Rob Beeman at James Cook University are doing the massive work out on the Barrier Reef. Well, this is something that he could get people to use as well. And so a result of that, if we can encourage people anywhere in the world to do increased citizen science and bathymetric data capture, then that increases our maritime knowledge, not just for safety of navigation, but marine research sciences, marine property management, all of those really good sorts of things. So that's UMap, and I'm happy to talk more about that to anyone, as long as you don't ask me any technical questions on the how. And look, give it a go. There's a couple of links in the presentation to the UMap itself, that YouTube demo, and there's actually a really good article in Hydro magazine earlier this year, which is about 20-25 pages specifically on the pilot and the background, so that's actually really interesting. So I said I was going to talk quickly to a couple of the other opportunities while I've got people in the room. One of the really big issues for the hydrographic community and the nautical cartography community is we don't have enough people, and we've got no way of actually providing training to people within our region. So 4 years ago, IIC Academy developed a training program for hydrographic survey and nautical cartography, and we've had it recognised by the International Boards of Standards and Competencies, which is recognised by the International Hydro Organisation and the International Cartographic Association. It maximises online and distance learning. And so we've now run them for 4 years. You can see the number of students that we've put in from this region alone, and it's really exciting. So that was the Hydro course. This is the Carto course. So if you want more information on those, please let me know. And I was going to talk on S100, but I'm out of time. So if any of your organisations are responsible for S100, IIC is probably the leading provider of S100 support to national authorities. And I'm trying to get out there and help, because S100's got to be out by 2026, and most national authorities aren't ready for that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Interesting. As people from the islands, we deal with marine all the time, and it's good to see that your presentation is about navigation, safety, and all that at sea. Thank you. Do we have questions or comments for David?
No technical questions.
Sorry, I might actually be asking a technical question here, but how do you reconcile vertical datums in remote areas where you may not have external control to use, and with your use of commercial sounding equipment? How do you deal with absolute accuracy in those sorts of areas?
So for the Inuit communities, I mentioned that they have the the Community Hydrographic team at the Canadian Hydrographic Service. So they have modelling that covers all of the Arctic. So when the communities submit their data, they will take it in, and they will correct it for tides and link it to the local appropriate vertical reference frame. Outside of Canada, obviously, whoever's collecting the data would have to do it themselves, or just accept the fact that it's untide corrected or similar, which isn't ideal, but again, if you have nothing else, it's actually better than nothing. Yeah.
Sorry, also possibly a technical question, but you said, so you make the maps and then you supply it back to the communities.
Yep.
That they use on their vessels. Does that take the form of like an S57 chart or a...
Yeah, exactly. So I'm impressed you've got S57, S100 terminology. The information that's sent back, they can ingest into their own navionics system or their own vessel pilotage system, or they can obviously drag it into any GIS system and manipulate it from there. But the whole intent is to give it to them in a format that can be used in their navigation systems and share it with their others. What's interesting is they were really concerned about, and this kind of goes against the big open sharing thing, but they were concerned about protecting their own knowledge information. So with the Canadian Hydrographic Service, they hold store on their behalf, but they'll often give the community, only that community, the data, so the community can share it amongst their township, but not necessarily others, which is not necessarily the intent, but if the idea is to protect them, then it does help.
So then, have you run into issues with like the S57 and open source software kind of roadblocks there, or is that too technical?
What was that, sorry?
Like, have you run into any kind of roadblocks or issues like trying to use that S57 kind of standard and formats and that with the open source software like QGIS, or not?
Not that I'm aware of. I've not been told that we've had any specific examples of that, but we actually have built and released our own electronic chart system that's available on Apple and Android. And so because we have that background bringing in official S57 data, then we will have built this to the same standard so it can be brought into any open source in theory.
Right, thanks.
Hi, sorry, I'm fascinated by the concept of perfect being the enemy of good. And I think that as geospatial specialists, we're always driven to get higher precision, higher accuracy, keep searching for that perfection. But I think the perception of the public is they want things in a more timely fashion. And I think this is a really good example of that idea of a chart is better than no chart.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if, from your perspective and your experience as a commercial vendor in this space, are you starting to see a shift towards that kind of more timely, maybe less finessed product that has been the standard for decades on end?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was quite intimately involved with Oz Seabed for a period of time, and that's probably where I saw the biggest change in attitude. So all of the hydrographic and bathymetric data that was held by Australia was pretty much out of the Aussie Hydro Office, so it was captured to a very high standard or not at all. Now with Oz Seabed, we're seeing, in fact, there's really good application for this data, and it doesn't have to be to that standard, it can just be to any standard, particularly when you're talking about large areas. So I mentioned Rob Beeman and the Barrier Reef. I mean, the work that he's been doing using crowdsourced tiny wee loggers that just plug into your navigation system is fantastic, and the products he's generating are amazing, and none of that's to hydrographic standards at all, but you couldn't argue that it's not a valuable benefit. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Last one from Emma.
I'm always interested in the economics of open source, and companies like companies as well, where we have to run commercially as well as provide to the community. I'm interested in the economic benefits for you. Is there something that it's just up to your workflows, and so you're just giving it to others, or as in it's saved you time, or is it a benefit to your people, or is it just like a really nice thing that you've done?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. I mean, I said we're a family business. It's owned by a man and his family, and he's really quite philanthropic. So he often does things that make absolutely no business sense. But his belief is that things come round in the long run, and if you build relationship, then something might come back. So I mean, this one here was slightly different because we were actually paid by the Canadian Hydrographic Service to build it. So it was a commercial activity for us, but they then allowed us to release it open. So, I mean, we make no benefit from this anymore other than the fact that I get to give these presentations and show what we can do. But there's been a lot of other things. Like I mentioned, we created an electronic chart system, and it's out there freely available, and it uses national authority data. That cost us a lot of money. We have not seen any financial return on that yet, but that actually gave us the knowledge we needed to do a whole lot of other things, particularly in the S100 space. So, yeah, I mean, I got no idea if it's ever going to pay us a return on that particular part, but in the broader scheme of things, I think it's just good business practice,
Thanks, David.
Thanks very much.
Please, one round of applause for David.